Welcome, everyone. My name is Franco Pierno. I'm professor in Italian linguistics at the University of Toronto, Canada. I welcome you today at the Young Investigator RnB4CULTURE Award of ISNAF. ISNAF is the Italian Scientists and Scholars North American Foundation. We are the largest no-profit organization which regroups Italian scientists and scholars that are located in North America, US, Canada, and Mexico. Our mission is to convert, to empower, and celebrate the Italian diaspora located in North America. As part of the celebration, we have our Young Investigators Awards. And these awards are extremely competitive. And by them, we want to reward and celebrate our best scholars in different areas. Today, we are here for a symposium to listen to 3 finalists to the RnB4CULTURE Award, which focuses on humanities and specifically on Italian culture. And this award recognizes the vibrancy of research in Italian culture is evolving, naturally expressed in a variety of ways, such as innovative uses of technology, or originality of approach, or contribution to wider questions and trends in the humanities at large. And today we want also to thank the sponsor, Fabrizio Renzi, who is the CEO of RnB4CULTURE. The way this symposium will work will be the following. We have 3 finalists. We will give their brief presentations, and then you will be invited to ask questions. Please put your questions in the Q&A section that you can see in the bottom bar of Zoom. Well, I would like also to introduce the jury. The jurors. We have a Professor Stefania Lucamante from the University of Cagliari, Professor Gianni Cicali from Georgetown University, Washington, and Professor Stefano Iossa from University of Palermo. And now I'm very excited to introduce you the 3 finalists. We have Laura Ingallinella, who is assistant professor at the University of Toronto, Italian Studies and the Center for Reformation and Renaissance Studies. Pantalea Mazzitello, assistant professor of teaching at the University of California, Irvine, and Giancarlo Tursi, who is assistant professor in translation studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Now, I think the floor is yours, Laura. You are the first finalist who will give the presentation.
Thank you very much, Professor Pierno, for your kind introduction, and thank you to ISNAF, to RnB4CULTURE, to the jury, and for everyone attending this webinar for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Now I will share my screen. There we go. So although my research focuses on Renaissance Italian culture, I would like to begin by discussing 2 case studies from the present day that will help me frame the rationale for my first monograph entitled The Fraudulent Muse, Gender and Literary Forgery in Early Modern Italy. Now, many of you are likely familiar with Elena Ferrante, the pseudonymous author of My Brilliant Friend. Ferrante's novels have achieved international acclaim, captivating readers across the globe, especially here in North America. One fact that has consistently sparked debate, however, is Ferrante's decision to keep her identity a secret. Readers, journalists, and scholars have often speculated who the real Ferrante might be, with one of the most prominent theories being that the male writer Domenico Starnone is the author behind Ferrante's female persona. While this theory has gained significant attention, feminist scholars in Italian studies have pointed out the problematic implications of such claims, suggesting that a successful woman writer must, in fact, be a man, reinforces the cultural discomfort with female voices in literature. It perpetuates the idea that a man must be behind any significant literary achievement, and it calls into question the authenticity of women's voices. This debate around Ferrante's identity and her unmasking speaks to a larger issue. Why are women's voices, even today, more likely to be contested, questioned as inauthentic, and subject to scrutiny? Which leads me to my second preliminary example. Students often learn about the history of Italian literature and culture through anthologies that collect the works of writers across the centuries. For a long time, the representation of women's writing in these anthologies has been sorely lacking, particularly when it comes to the earlier periods of literary history. Now, today, there is more focus on incorporating women writers into the canon, with anthologies like Johnny Bertoliu's Controcanone, which you see here and which was published only 2 years ago, aiming to correct this representational gap. However, even modern anthologies run into a significant problem when they address the medieval period. Unlike the national literary traditions of France and Provence, Italy does not have a substantial body of poetry written by secular women during the Middle Ages. Before the early 15th century, the canon of women's literature in Italy was dominated by religious writers. Some of them, such as Catherine of Siena, were incredibly influential, but this does not detract from the fact that we can count on very few examples of secular women writers, such as 13th century poet known as Compiuta Donzella. This is what the historical record seems to show. But if one looks at earlier anthologies, such as Luisa Bergalli's collection from 1726, one would think that the opposite was true. In early modern collections of early Italian poetry, we do find a substantial number of poems and works attributed to medieval Italian women, far more than modern scholarship acknowledges. The reason for this discrepancy is because many texts attributed to medieval Italian women have turned out to be forgeries, texts written by men but falsely attributed to women. These forgeries, which I term gendered forgeries, constitute the archive at the heart of my book, The Fraudulent Muse, together with the tales surrounding the lives and experiences of these fictitious female writers. Gendered forgeries were primarily created between the 16th and the early 18th centuries, a time when both the canon of Italian literature and the idea of a female literary tradition were being shaped. My research aims to answer three questions. First, why were gendered forgeries created in the first place? Second, how did male authors go about performing female voices when they wished to pass as authentic? And third, how did these forgeries infiltrate the literary canon, influencing our understanding of women's capacity to write, and by extension, our idea of literature more broadly? My claim is that gendered forgeries not only challenge our understanding of women's writing through the centuries, but also complicate the ways in which communities shape and shaped their political and literary histories. They serve as a mirror, reflecting the anxieties of their time, often offering insights in how gender roles were constructed, perceived, and deployed by their creators and the communities to which they belonged. Now, forgery has long been the subject of scholarly attention, particularly through the work of Anthony Grafton, whose Forgers and Critics is a foundational text in the field. However, little attention has been paid so far to the role of women and gender in the history of forgery. The Renaissance has been seen as a golden age for the creation of fakes. In Italy, where humanism, the rise of philology as a discipline, and humanists' cult of antiquity bestowed incredible power to the creation of exposure of forgeries. Judging from the work of historians of forgery, however, one might be tempted to conclude that spuriousness and forgery are entirely male affairs, that forgers, critics, and their audiences all belong to the same gender, along with the subjects of their forgeries. On the contrary, early modern Italy witnessed a real proliferation of fakes related to women, their voices, and their presence in the history of literature. My research aims to fill this gap by offering a comprehensive study of how these forgeries reflected and influenced the political and cultural environment of early modern Italy. I place these works attributed to fictitious poets, and the tales surrounding their lives and experiences as intellectuals in conversation with the contexts in which they were created. My goal is to understand the social, political, and cultural pressures that made these forgeries possible, but more importantly, urgent and appealing to their creators. Following Grafton's call to understand forgeries as crucial moments in the making of intellectual history, I treat gender forgeries as cultural artifacts that reveal deep-seated anxieties and desires within their early modern Italian creators. These texts were not just inspired by the fraudulent muse of dissimulation. They were instead performative acts imbued with political implications. Now, in the strictest sense, the gender forgeries that I track in my study represent a unique subset of literary falsification, where male authors not only forged texts, but performatively inhabited female identities to promote their social standing or their communities. My approach blends is traditional close reading, archival research, and the history of ideas with insights from gender studies and critical theory. In the past 2 decades, we are lucky enough that scholars like Virginia Cox, Diana Robin, and Sarah Ross have produced exceptional work on women's writing in Renaissance Italy. My research builds onto this scholarship, showing a new facet of how intellectual women were seen, constructed, and publicized. The history of gender forgery in Italy, I argue, ties closely to this surge, the Renaissance, of women's writing during the 15th and 16th century that has been studied by Cox, Robin, Ross, and others. Renaissance Italy saw more female authors published than any other European country at the time. This shift redefined women as producers of knowledge, not just consumers. And more specifically, patriarchism played a central role in welcoming and legitimizing secular women writers, providing both recognition and authority. My research, in fact, shows that patriarchism and the patriarchist movement became a laboratory for the creation of gendered forgeries. Now, by combining traditional historical research with insights from forgery studies and gender studies, I have been able to demonstrate that gender forgeries served to reinforce patriarchal structures, even as they sought to elevate the contribution of women. Male authors engaged in what is typically called cross-gender ventriloquism, the performing as women to insert voices into the canon, as well as the histories of their communities. When they performed as women, forgers, first and foremost, performed through their idea of what a woman intellectual should be, simultaneously pious and secular, virtuous yet also scandalous, tasty in her engagement with the dominant culture of her day, but also easy to enshrine as an ornamental curiosity. Something, in just a few words, to admire, celebrate, but also set aside in the annals of history once she has served her purpose. Take, by way of example, this sonnet, Tacete o Maschi, attributed to Leonora della Genga, which boldly addresses women's intellectual rights and ambitions, contributing to the so-called woman question or querelle des femmes. Women know how to wield the sword, they know how to rule empires, and they know how to find a direct path to Mount Helicon, she writes. No man could ever take our merit or our crown. Leonora's words, the words written by the male academic that crafted her sonnets, command men to pause and listen, embodying traditional pro-woman arguments with a more assertive tone compared to contemporary women authors who took part in the woman question. Leonora's verses were crafted to provoke and to be marketed as a sensation that would make a lasting impression on readers.
5 minutes.
Now, one of the central findings in my research is that many of these forgeries were created in response to a growing demand for literary founding mothers, early female figures who could be presented as precursors to the women writers of the Renaissance. As women like Vittoria Colonna, Veronica Gambara, and Laura Terracina gained widespread recognition in the 16th century, male authors became increasingly invested in creating precedents for their successes. These invented figures, these fictitious poets, were meant to create a sense of community and tradition, anchoring the real achievement of women in a historical past. By fabricating early female poets, intellectuals in various regions of Italy were able to enhance the prestige of their communities, asserting cultural primacy and solidifying their own place within literary history. It is not by chance that this phenomenon took place as poets like Colonna became the icons of a new literary age and were celebrated as women who brought honor and glory to their cities, and where literary history at the same time began to coalesce as a discipline interested in the beginnings and the archaeology of a literary genre. Thanks to a humanistic tradition that positioned learned ladies as ornamental marvels that could give honor to a given community, fictitious founding mothers were deployed as strategic assets for the goals of an individual, their family, or their community. For example, Leonora della Genga, as I mentioned, and others were all invented to promote the town of Fabriano in central Italy with a claim to significance and to negotiate the town's political independence from the papal state. By fabricating these women as accomplished medieval poets, forgers not only bolstered the reputation of their town, but also created a fictitious lineage of female poetic excellence. Now, the impact of these gender forgeries extended far beyond their immediate contexts. These texts shaped the way women's voices were understood and incorporated into literary history for centuries. By inserting fabricated women into the canon, forgers helped create a false impression of women's literary contributions, retrofitting their understanding of women's voices, ideas, and struggles as intellectuals into the medieval past. At the same time, these forgeries undermine the work of real women intellectuals by constructing the early history of women's writers as a fragile epistemic space that could be easily put into question. At the same time, on the contrary, these forgeries spurred debate on women's rights in a positive direction, inspiring feminist poets even today. This manipulation of literary history had, in just a few words, long-lasting effects in multiple directions, influencing how we understand the role of women in Italian literature and beyond. By filling the gaps in literary history with forged texts, forgers and critics manipulated the real contribution of women, replacing them with idealized and controlled versions of female intellectual labor. I approach my conclusion. In the Fraudulent Muse, I argue that gendered forgeries were not just literary curiosities or isolated acts of deception. They were powerful tools that helped shape the trajectory of Italian history and the way women's intellectual contributions were perceived. These forgeries reveal deep anxieties about women's growing authority in literature and culture and reflect a desire to control and contain that authority. By studying gender forgery, we can better understand how cultural narratives about gender, authorship, and intellectual labor were constructed and used in early modern Italy. More broadly, this work invites us to reconsider how we approach questions of authenticity in relation to women's voices, both in early modern texts, but also in contemporary debates like the one surrounding Elena Ferrante. The study of gender forgery also speaks to larger issues of representation and power in the literary canon. Just as we see with Ferrante today, the voices of women, whether real or imagined, are often contested or undermined, revealing a persistent discomfort with female authorship and intellectual labor. With this research, I hope to contribute to a more nuanced understanding of how gender shaped literary traditions and historiography, and how these traditions in turn shaped our understanding of gender. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Laura. Now, as turn of Pantalea Mazzitello, who, as I said, is assistant professor, Department of European Languages Studies at University of California, Irvine. Pantalea, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Pierno, for your introduction. Thank you for the ISNAF organization for having us here. It's a pleasure and honor to present my research with all of you. So my academic background focuses on the Italian medieval and early modern periods, and my interests include parodic forms, particularly the parody and subversion of the sacred, and relations between parody and satire, and more generally, the dynamics of laughter and humor in medieval and early modern Italian culture. So my current project is on blasphemers and blasphemy in Italian Renaissance literature. This project examines the controversial topic of cursing God publicly, on stage, and in social interactions. The analysis of the literary representation of figures of blasphemers and expression of blasphemy is relevant as it reveals critical changes in the social and intellectual life of 16th century Italy, when we know society was evolving with new forms of interpersonal interactions in the context of emerging courtly and urban settings. In this period, intellectual elites began assigning more or equal importance to being a good member of society and a good Christian. As a result of these shifts, early modern Italy retained its concern about the religious implications of blasphemy, of course, but with a growing sensitivity to its behavioral and social implications. In that moment, blasphemy was not only considered reprehensible from a religious point of view, as had always been the case, but also represented an insulting expression that did not fit into a society informed by good manners, as it was being codified in the 16th century, where courtesy and gentleness in speech were gaining crucial relevance in social relations. More to the point, my project detects and uncovers humoristic and secular dimensions in using blasphemous utterances that did not and could not emerge from the study of historical documentation, on which the scholarship has been traditionally focused. Through my analysis of blasphemy in literary texts, my project seeks to achieve a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the value system underpinning social interactions and cultural and religious sensibilities in 16th century Italy. When approaching literary text, I consider several dimensions of blasphemy: the theological arguments against it, its juridical treatment by the civil law, the social aspects involved, and the attitude of the blasphemers towards the divine authority, meaning the question of hubris. I focus on the relationship between marginalized groups such as peasants, gamblers, prostitutes, and thugs, and the use of blasphemy as a verbal aggression and disruptive behavior. I also explore gender roles and gender perspectives in the use and treatment of blasphemy at the time. The corpus of my research includes medieval and early modern theological treatises, 16th and 17th century books of conduct and good manners, the so-called erudite comedies, novellas, rhymes, and pastorals. At this point, I must warn you the next part of my presentation contains some explicit and offensive language. The object of this research is the Italian bestemmia, a term that does not find a perfect translation in English, although I will use the word blasphemy for convenience in this talk. While the concept of blasphemy includes different elements that can be verbal and factual, the Italian bestemmia pertains to the specific domain of invectives and verbal expressions that are meant to be offensive against God, the Virgin Mary, the saints, and the relics. The Italian language has developed a rich vocabulary and a broad range of possibilities for the creation of insults towards the deity. So bestemmia is not composed of a fixed expression, as in the English holy shit, for example, but on the contrary, it can be worded each time differently. So bestemmia is a category of swear words aimed specifically at insulting God by combining the name of a holy entity with another term, and this combination is meant to be immediately perceived as insulting or at the very least irreverent. The endless possible combinations make the process creative and changeable according to the historical period, the cultural context, and popular trends. And this creativity contributes to the comedic effect of blasphemy in the text we are considering today. As historian Peter Burke states, the literary landscape of 16th century Italy offers a colorful spectrum of words. Here I selected some examples taken from the learned comedies. For example, from Dovizi da Bilbina Calandria, I quote, "In the name of heaven's pussy, didn't tell you just now that you shouldn't shout?" Or in the Marescalco by Pietro Aretino, "By the pussy of don't say who, don't swear, I believe you." Or in Ruzzante Moscheta, "Compare, comare, cause snatch, what's the matter with you?" By all the saints, by the blood of San Lazarus. Also in Giordano's Bruno Candelaio, by the body of Our Lady. And even in Machiavelli's Mandragola, the educated lawyer Nietzsche uses a blasphemous expression when he winks at the audience to make comments about Callimaco. "Oh my, by St. Butcher's pussy, this fellow's got me in the palm of his hand. Several examples can be found also in other genres, like in the Novelle by Matteo Bandello, by the body of San Perpisto, by God's ass. By God's ass is also in the Vita by Benvenuto Cellini, or in the earlier 300 Novelle by Franco Sacchetti, by the body of God, by God's gods. And even more in Ruzzante's early play Pastorale, by San Ragno's pussy, by the pussy of San Januarius, by the body of San Crivelo, and so on. A very last example from Francesco Berni's Rime, by Jesus Christ pussy, I said it, by the pussy of, I won't say whose, well, was St. Peter. So what is the historical intellectual tradition behind this way of phrasing blasphemies called swearing per membra, so swearing parts of the body? Several definitions of blasphemy have been provided through the history of Christianity, as the second commandment forbids taking God's name in vain. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas highlighted the inner falsity of blasphemy as an expression that states something false about God. In the 7th century, Edmond d'Auxerre first focused on the verbal element of the offense towards God, and in the 13th century, Vincent de Beauvais, in his Speculum Maius, identified different types of blasphemy, where the third type is to refer disrespectfully to the parts of the holy body. According to him, naming the divine body in vain and disrespectfully was a perversion of the meaning of God's incarnation. It also implied a perversion of the human body, turned into an object of derision. Guillaume Perrault, again in the 13th century, remarks on the same topic in his Summa de Virtutibus, stating how blasphemy named God's body parts that are not supposed to be named. But blasphemy was not only condemned by the Church, but also faced persecution by secular powers, starting with Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis in the 6th century. In the code, civil jurisdiction claimed the right to punish those who blaspheme, since by swearing they attract God's wrath towards the city, thus representing a threat to the security of the community the government must protect. At the end of the 13th century, the jurist Alberto Gandino composed one of the most widely used criminal law treatises in Italy, the Tractatus de Maleficiis, that assigned different fees or punishments to various cases of blasphemy. The charges were also based on whether the curse was directed at the outer parts or the inner parts of the holy body, where naming the inner parts were considered less guilty than naming the outer parts. In the 16th century, there is a proliferation of new tribunals that were technically part of the civil law, but were inspired by religious and moral principles, among which the very famous Esecutori contro la bestemmia in Venice. In most cases, blasphemy was not punished by itself, but as an aggravating circumstance of other crimes. And it was recognized as widespread among irregular and marginal groups in which tribunals like the Esecutori saw a rejection of the norms of civil coexistence, decorum, morality, and the precepts of the Church. While it is unquestionable that people have always blasphemed, it is only in this historical period that civil jurisdiction made a more deliberate attempt to punish blasphemous language as a way to control social behaviors. Blasphemy was also considered among the sins of the tongue, which come first through the mouth in the form of words. This concept relates directly to the idea of condemning blasphemy because it conveys and opens the gates to other deplorable behaviors, vices, but also crimes. This concept of blasphemy as both an instrument of and a gateway to misconduct represented the theoretical and theological reason behind the juridical connection between blasphemy and felony. As Melissa Moore points out, the true nature of bad words is to incite misbehavior and shock the interlocutor through a form of verbal violence that could also lead to a physical violence. Indeed, most of the time, the blasphemers filling the public records were gamblers, prostitutes, innkeepers, whoremasters, and soldiers of fortune. In one of Ludovico Ariosso's comedies, Lena, blasphemy is the first characteristic assigned to a bravo. Here we have one servant instructs another on how to look more menacing and says, "Try to look tough and behave like a bravo." And how does a bravo behave? Plenty of oaths and blasphemies by God and the saints. The use of blasphemy to display boldness also appears in the first book of the Courtier, where Castiglione describes the military qualities of the perfect courtiers and says, "How much more agreeable and admired is a warrior when he is modest, saying little and boasting hardly ever, the one who is forever singing his own praises and threatening all and sundry with his swearing and bragging. And this is simply the affectation of wanting to appear a bold fellow." At the beginning of the anonymous play Veneziana, the main character asks her female servant to act like a man, and blasphemy is mentioned as one of the main features. I quote, "Say like this a little bit, then start to blaspheme, so I can believe you're a man. I don't know what to say. Blaspheme the body of God, use bad words, as men do." As sociolinguistic studies have shown, the display of swaggery in masculinity is frequently accompanied by transgressive speech. As powerful speech, blasphemy gave these social subjects strong means of expression, for expressing threats, opinions, and aggressive attitudes associated with masculinity. In Aretino's
5
play,
minutes.
thank you, The Cortigiana, a dialogue unfolds employing a spectrum of blasphemy that varies and gradates according to the social agents associated with it. And I quote, "By the body of Judas, that's a child's oath. By the Gospels, that's our peasant's verse. By God's faith, the porter said that. By the blessed cross, women's words. Pussy blood, by the body of water. You really want me to swear? Why not? Of Christ, there, I said it." This long exchange is intended as a funny interlude to entertain the public. This kind of comedic relief discloses a division between what the authorities were trying to achieve in terms of condemnation of blasphemy and the public expectations. And this is just one of the aspects that we could not fully appreciate by relying solely on historical documentation without the support of literary text. And here comes a question. Was cursing God perceived as funny? At least as for the learned comedies that read today, we can argue that not only cursing God must have been funny, but it probably met an expectation from the audience. Indeed, the new theatre arising in the 16th century, for which these comedies were written, was conceived as a permanent theatre, a dedicated space to host a secular performance designed for an elite public. Its establishment was facilitated by a cultural complicity among producers, organizers, patrons, and consumers, thus creating a closed cycle of production and reception. The language used in these comedies, Blasphemy included, also reflected these dynamics and expectations. Before moving towards the conclusion, I want to consider a few topical passages in books of conduct that reflects on humor's use of blasphemy in a theoretical manner. The authors of the most popular conduct books lament the use of blasphemy to elicit laughter among the members of the intellectual and aristocratic elite that constitute the audience of the text we have considered so far. In The Courtier, Castiglione deprecates courtiers who try to be witty through swearing. I quote, "We should also avoid irreligious jokes, for this can turn an attempt at wit into blasphemy. And then we find ourselves growing more and more ingenious in the way we blaspheme, and thereby a man seems to be seeking glory for something for which he deserves not merely condemnation, but also severe punishment. And therefore, those who wish to appear amusing by showing a little reverence for the Almighty ought to be driven out of a good society." Similarly, De La Casa's Galateo warned against swearing. I quote, "Neither in jest nor in earnest should anyone say anything against God or his saints, no matter how witty and pleasant he might be. Remember that to speak lightly of God is not only the sign of a wicked and sinful man, but also the vice of a man with no manners." Also, Stefano Vazzo, in his dialogue Civil Conversation, discussed the impious speech. I quote, "These horrible swearers which make a profession of it for their pleasure, rather than moved with choler." Vazzo added that this was a widespread habit among courtiers, therefore, I quote, "As a Christian, you ought to fly them," meaning the swearers, "yet as a courtier, you cannot keep you from them, not so much for the great number of them, as for the error of the world which esteemed them in the role of the tolerable." He complained that in his days there were few who did not think to I quote, adorn their words with blasphemy as if to decorate a discourse with illustrations. I would like to conclude that 16th century Italian literature depicts a culture in which blasphemous language was employed to trivialize the divine with the intention of shocking and disrupting. This shock could also induce laughter by surprising the audience with an uncommon, unexpected juxtaposition of sacred and profane terms. Moreover, this disruption primarily acted to the detriment of social and civil interactions. This project ultimately seeks to reinterpret the presence of blasphemy in Renaissance Italy in the belief that studying the history of its use and condemnation informs our understanding of contemporary issues related to religious tolerance and freedom of expression in a global society. My research aims to contribute meaningfully to the ongoing conversation on developing new approaches to studying the past. Indeed, I plan to develop this research into a broader pedagogical project on Italian humor and comedy from the Middle Ages to new trends in pop culture and social media for students enrolled in Italian studies programs in the US. By examining a wide corpus of parodical and satirical texts and artifacts spanning a broad chronological and sociocultural spectrum, my research seeks to offer a small contribution to a nuanced reading of the present of Italian culture. Thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Pantalea. I have to apologize because I forgot the QA time after Laura's presentation. So I suggest now to have the QA time for Pantalea's presentation and right after the QA time for Laura's presentation and then after Professor Tursi's presentation. So now we have 8 minutes for Q&A time for Pantalea's presentation. Sorry again. Gianni.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I noticed that you have mentioned words or profanities such as potte, for example. Did you look as well in your research to the extensive use of this profanity in late 17th century and 18th century comic libretti, especially from Naples? Or does this include, can this be included in your research, or you limit your research only to the Renaissance, just to use a word?
No, I plan to expand my research, especially comparing different theatrical tradition. So I'm moving now from this material that I work on the 16th century, like late medieval, but no, I definitely tend to move forward. So thank you so much for this indication about the...
And also one little thing about profanities and blasphemy. There are a couple of sacred plays, second half of the 1500s, more or less. I don't remember exactly the date, I'm sorry. One is about the so-called Leggenda della Croce Inventio Crucis, and the other one is the sacred play of Agnolo Ebreo. And I don't remember exactly the Agnolo Ebreo, but in the first one by Beltramo Poggi, there is a couple of Jewish characters which are, sorry for the bisticcio, they are characterized with a language with profanities. So it's also interesting to see how some Jewish character in Renaissance theater are, portrayed through language.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't have the time to talk about it today, but also in other genre, for example, in the epic genre, more of the time we have the others, so not the Christian characters, design as the blasphemers. So, for example, the Muslim knights or the Jewish people being those who blaspheme. So, like you can see, for example, in the epic. So that is very, very, very relevant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stefano Iossa.
Yeah, I raised my hand more than once. thank you so much for this interesting talk. I wonder how you take into consideration the issue of literary genres and to what extent is fiction relevant to your discourse, especially when we take into consideration two such sentences as from Ariosto's various works. So, Rodomonte bestemmia il ciel con spaventoso grido, to what extent is this to be taken seriously? And versus the sentence in the Satire, for example, bestemmian Cristo solo gli uomini ribaldi. So we've got two very different frameworks for Ariosto's sentences about blasphemy. And the former is supposed to be taken as part of the fictional game within the religious divide between Christians and Muslims, whereas the other is related to a moral issue, gli uomini ribaldi. So to what extent are you including this framework of literary genres within your discourse, and to what extent can we take seriously all sorts of blasphemies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. The issue of genre is very relevant to this discourse because, for example, when we talk about erudite, so-called erudite comedies, we have a corpus very delineate, right? So we have like a relatively small production in certain ages for specific events. So we can say, for example, okay, we can tell that from these learned comedies that blasphemy was used to elicit laughter among the public. When we move, for example, to the epic genre, we have different issues. For example, about Rodomonte bestemmio. Few questions on that. Who Rodomonte is blaspheming? He's blaspheming the Muslim God. He's blaspheming the Christian God. We don't know. We just know that depicting him as a blasphemer is a way for the author to portray his character as a bad character, as someone with a bad morality, with a bad religion. Even if I would really like to know who is the God that Rodomonte is blaspheming and in which language he is blaspheming and what actually he's saying. So the problem with the epic is that swearing words, since it's a low expression of the language, we don't have swearing or bad words really in epic because that won't fit the genre, being a high genre. So we lived with this doubt. What did he say exactly? So yeah, the question of the genre is definitely relevant in the way that blasphemy was used to have different effect among the publics, right? So definitely yes. And moving to the epic poem is one of the projects that I have in mind because that's arise all another issues and questions that we don't have in the comedy genre. Today, I mainly take example from comedy genre. So we had erudite comedies, but also novelles, rhyme, pastoral, but they all attend to the comedy category, right? I did not pick the example from any other category today. So definitely, yes, thank you.
I don't know if there are other questions. Giancarlo and then Laura.
Great. Well, thank you for raising your hand as well, Laura. I wasn't sure if we were allowed to ask questions, but I had one burning question since so it's about like Bakhtin's theory of the carnivalesque, which I engage in and we'll talk about in my talk. But you know, he has this notion of the carnivalesque as like an upside down world, monde à l'envers, so either upside down or inside out. And you know, obviously, the carnivalesque is a space replete with vulgar humor and reversals. So I'm just wondering if, with this idea of an upside down world, if there's like a spatial dimension that you analyze with this bestemie, if there's a way in which the low is mixed with the high, or the inside out is shown. How these blasphemies maybe have a spatial dimension to them.
Thank you so much for the question. That's a very good point. So what's the difference in between this use of blasphemy and, for example, the carnivalesque parodic tradition during the Middle Ages? I think that the most relevant one is that medieval parodic carnivalesque usually act on the church and figures related to the church. So we have a representation of upside down, for example, of monks, bishops, and popes. Where like blasphemy moved the focus from attacking people belonging to the church to God itself, which is a big switch in between like mocking person like the church as an institution, so from the monks to the pope, and making jokes about God and the saints. So that's the big difference in between the study of the parodic carnivalesque and blasphemy. That was a very short answer to a question that could be very, very more longer. Thank you.
Thank you, Pantalea. This was a great presentation. So my question is about timelines, because I think on the other hand of your, at the sort of later end of your corpus, there is the Council of Trent. And so my question is, like, do you have in your archive texts from after Trent, and is blasphemy treated differently in these texts? And another question is, like, for pre-existing texts, is there any censorship that takes place when it comes to blasphemy?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, absolutely. So the text that I am working on, you can really tell that they fit chronological years from the end of the Middle Ages, right before the Council of Trent. Because at that point, we don't have blasphemies anymore on text for a long time. Which is also very interesting when we talk about theater, because if we talk about the Commedia dell'arte or the theater with Goldoni, it's hard to say, oh, well, for sure they did not blaspheme on the stage. Probably they did. We know that, like in the Lazzi, you know, there's something that just a canovaccio, but then the actors added more things on that. So we don't have them written anymore, but it doesn't mean anything about what they did in the performance, right? So there's another fascinating topic. And as before, I really didn't encounter forms of official censorship on blasphemies, but I noticed that also in a lot of displays, sometimes the blasphemy is interrupted in the script, in the text. So like, oh, by the body of puntini, 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 or by the pulse of puntini, puntini, puntini. So we can assume that something happened on stage at that point, but was like censored in the text. And then after the Council of Trent, we don't have blasphemy on the written page for a while. Thank you.
Thank you. We
All
are
right, time's up.
Q&A.
Thanks.
Thank you. Now the Q&A for Laura's presentation.
Pantalea.
Yeah, I'm asking immediately. I was curious, Laura, if you already had the chance to work on the last anthology by Bertoglio, Contro Canone, because I'm looking for something for the second year students here at UCI. So I was like, oh, that's an anthology that it's of interest. Have you had a chance to see it?
I haven't used it yet because I haven't taught a course on women and gender where in the institution where I teach. But I've seen Johnny has been invited to U of T to give a Goggia lecture, and it's incredibly promising because of the essentially connection throughout. It's very systematic, and one of the beautiful things that the anthology does is that it takes a critical approach to the marginalized in literature. It starts with women, but it gives a lot of like nips and nuggets to go beyond that community as well. So you would think there is only that community being explored from the point of view of, again, writing and intellectual labor, but there is actually much more. So highly recommend it. I would experiment with it, once I get the chance to teach a course like that. Absolutely.
You let me know. Thank you.
Stefano?
Yes, Ariosto turns useful to every purpose. So what do you think of Ariosto's statement in favor of women who were superior to men, which is, of course, related to previous statements by Goggio, Equicola, and many others? And all these are men's voices. So to what extent do you think that we can really undermine forgery by women in the verge of the judgment given later by critics who decided that women were not worth being considered? Because at the time, I think women protagonism is much higher than we expect. And in fact, women forgery may be assumed as part of this new discourse of new abilities that women are able to put forward in their social roles.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And in fact, I put an Ariosto illustration just as a hook because I would have loved an Ariosto question. So it's interesting because, again, you raised the point of I think the biggest difference between some of the case studies that I analyzed, because I have like a capacious early modern, as I sort of like, frame it, that goes from the mid 16th century until the late 1700s in my analysis. And you can definitely see that there is a different approach in the forgeries produced, essentially right after Ariosto's success, and at a time in which essentially pro-woman literature, thanks to the actual, I cited Vittoria Colonna, who is mentioned by Ariosto. Again, this is a moment in which essentially the male intelligentsia starts realizing these are intellectuals that we want to welcome into the academies, that we want to celebrate in a certain specific way. I think my point is a little bit more biting about these celebrations, because it is like, within celebration, there is a sort of essential work of co-opting a certain intellectual value. So again, it's a double-edged sword. We could call it that. And directly to the texts that constitute my archive, for example, it is clear to me, for example, that at least like the majority of the forgers who essentially devised their poets, female poets, as pro-woman, they had Ariosto in mind when they were crafting their celebration of women. There are specific points of texts in a way very similar to what Pantalea explained, like, from the point of view of textual analysis, where I am able to see this poem attributed to a woman is actually citing Ariosto, but it is a woman that is purported to be writing in the 14th century. So it's really very interesting because, again, it shows a web not only of essentially ideas that are circulating and percolating within certain communities, but also, again, true and hard intertextual connections. These people were reading, obviously, and receiving Ariosto, and they were repurposing it, some of it, to present it as being written by a woman, which is incredibly interesting to me. It's also, again, it is a point about gendered performance, because there is a lot of discussion about, especially also in theater studies, what it means to perform as a woman. In my case, the result that I've seen from the research that I've done is that there is only a certain point to which these authors are preoccupied with sounding female. They want to convey a certain kind of ideas. They don't care about the language, about making their women sound demure, for example. This is something that happens much later in time. They want them bold, but this is the way in which you happen to find a little bit of Ariosto sprinkled in those texts as well.
2 minutes.
I don't know if there are other questions, otherwise we can start with Giancarlo's presentation. So I think, Giancarlo, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. So I will share my screen. Thank you. I want to say, first of all, what an honor it is to be here as a finalist for the ISNAF Young Investigator Award. I very much consider myself a young investigator. I received my PhD a little more than 2 years ago, and I'm genuinely thrilled to be able to share some of my works in progress with you today. Even though the subject of my talk today will touch mostly on Italian literature, I should mention that my background is in comparative literature and that I work across several language and literature zones, French and Italian mostly, but also to an extent Spanish. I received my master's at the Sorbonne in Paris and my PhD at New York University, where I wrote a dissertation on the phenomenon of dialectal translations of Dante's Divine Comedy in 19th century Unification era Italy. I've since been working as an assistant professor in the French and Italian department at UC Santa Barbara, where I'm also co-director of the Translation Studies program. Currently, I am on a 10-month Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship at the American Academy of Rome with the aim of turning my doctoral dissertation into a book. I would like to discuss with you the specifics of this project before explaining how it fits into the broader theme of Italian dialects as world literature I have chosen as the subject of my talk today. Before I get into the weeds of this project, however, I feel I should give some further biographical information about myself and explain just how it is that I came to be interested in the seemingly arcane question of Italian dialects. My father is Italian and my mother is Salvadorian American. I grew up in my father's hometown of Martina Franca in Puglia, a small town in the southern region of Puglia, until age 8. Although we only ever spoke standard Italian at home, I was surrounded by the dialect of my grandparents, parents, and to an extent, even cousins' generation. With time, I have made it a point to be more conversant in it, practicing it with my family and advising ad hoc conjugation charts for myself whenever I return there to visit. I sometimes like to think that I am the first person to ever learn the dialect as a foreign language, and in fact, my family often makes fun of my foreign, that is to say, Italian accent when I try to speak it. We moved back to my mother's adopted hometown of Los Angeles in 1994. Fittingly, among my last memories of that period is watching Italy lose to Brazil in the World Cup final held in Los Angeles. Although it would become for me a kind of belated mother tongue, perhaps even a dominant language, the terms for such phenomenon have always eluded me. The truth is, I didn't speak a word of English until then. I was able to maintain my Italian thanks to the yearly trips my father and I would take to Martina in the summer, as well as a year of study abroad in Padua as an undergraduate. But I had to eventually mourn the loss of this so-called mother tongue, technically my father's, and come to terms with my unique status as a hyphenated Italian-American, ultimately more at home in my second language, technically my mother's. Such reflections on what it means to be a foreigner, on who is a foreigner, where, when, have informed much of my academic work. I regularly teach a class at UC Santa Barbara entitled Poetics of the Second Language. It explores the work of authors who, for one reason or another, choose to write in a foreign language. I assign Italophone authors like Giancarlo, who pithily refers to her late career adoption of the Italian language as a, quote, experiment in weakness, Pierpaolo Pasolini, who learned, wrote, and promoted the dialects of Friulian and Roman, Amaro Lacus, who self-translates himself from Arabic into Italian, as well as Francophone ones like Louis Wolfson, the American schizophrenic who could not bear to hear his native language, and so devised a complex method of translating every sentence into a foreign phrase with the same sound and meaning, a process he details in his 1970 book, Le Schizo et les Langues, written in his adopted language of French. The book, perhaps fittingly, has not been translated into English, which has necessitated me providing students with ad hoc translations of the text. In time, at the risk of committing a divine injustice to Wolfson, I would love to undertake a complete translation of this text. Indeed, rather than lost in translation, as the saying goes, I have come to find a sort of home in both the theory and practice of it. Like many of the authors I teach, I have also found refuge in the practice of learning foreign languages, perhaps because it is familiar to me, or because, as the experience of dialect in Italy taught me, there is no such thing as a truly native language. In the case of Spanish, another mother tongue I had to learn belatedly, The trip away from home has brought me closer to another home, El Salvador, where my mother and her family lived until the eve of the Civil War. At UC Santa Barbara, I regularly teach Spanish language authors with an emphasis on those writing in Spanglish, itself a kind of dialect. Writers like Gloria Anzaldúa, Susana Chavez Silverman, and Juno Diaz, all of whom struggle with questions of multilingualism in their own way. I've also overseen several undergraduate translation capstone projects on Spanish literature. I have recently started learning the indigenous Mayan language Cachuquel, spoken by roughly 400,000 people in Guatemala. Learning Cachuquel in particular has invigorated my reflection on Italian dialects. While not a dialect in a strict sense, Cachuquel is, like many other indigenous languages, a minority language that has historically been suppressed. It comes as a surprise to many people outside of Latin America to know that Mayan languages, let alone Mayan people, still exist, just as it comes as a surprise to many people outside of Italy to know that dialects exist. And what exactly is a dialect, many ask? Is it just like an accent or a slang? In Guatemala, where 25 indigenous languages are spoken, of which 22 are Mayan, the number of speakers dropped precipitously following the decades-long Civil War from 1960 to 1996, during which indigenous people were targeted as suspected conspirators of communist militia. Their languages have historically been referred to as dialectos, even as they bear no linguistic relation to the dominant language Spanish. Each of these languages does, however, branch off into various micro-local languages that might effectively be termed dialects. However, because of the negative connotation of this term, linguists nowadays prefer to refer to them as variantes or variants. Recently, there has been an effort to revalorize these languages. The Academy of Mayan Languages of Guatemala was founded in 1990 with the aim of codifying and standardizing these variants. In stark contrast to other cases of language standardization, such as the Italian one, the process has been decisively more inclusive and democratic. The academia painstakingly surveying local speakers to build a common language from, as it were, the ground up. I can relate through my own experience learning Cachuquel that a common response to the question of pronunciation was simply pick your region. Italy, too, I argue in my book, tentatively entitled Dialectal Dante, Politics and Poetics of Translation in Risorgimento Italy, could have gone this pluralistic route. The 50-some 19th century dialectal translations of Dante's Divine Comedy I uncovered in the archives of the National Library of Florence attest to such an alternative vision for the national language.
2 minutes.
Appearing at a time when not only the nation, but the language was being unified, such a phenomenon, I argue, contains a puzzling ambivalence. On the one hand, the decision to translate Dante into dialect can be seen as conspiring with the unification movement, familiarizing a linguistically diverse population, of which it is reported only 2.3% spoke the national language, with this foundational work of Italian literature. On the other hand, there is something decidedly perverse about doing to Dante's language what Dante did to Latin in the early Renaissance, contesting its hegemony, defending the eloquence of the so-called vulgar or vernacular languages. I'm thinking here, of course, of Dante's linguistic treatise, De Vulgari Eloquentia, in which he defends his decision to write in Tuscan instead of Latin. My book traces the shifting negotiation between dialect and language, the translators and Dante, during a period I propose we refer to as the Long Risorgimento. From the enthusiasm of the 1860s, the culminating decade of unification, when a more inclusive framework for the nation could still be imagined, through the disillusionment of the post-unification decades, when the so-called Southern question, which blames unification's failure on the South's perceived backwardness, arises. To finally, the advent of fascism, which claims to have accomplished what the Risorgimento couldn't, namely a synthesis of the national and the local, language and dialect, the state and the individual. What emerges, I argue, is a portrait of a nation in translation with important implications for contemporary language politics. In tandem with this project, I am working on an English translation and critical edition of Giuseppe de Domenici's 1900 Canti dell'altra vita, Cantos from the Other Life, a parodic rewriting in Leccese of the Divine Comedy as an uprising of the damned in hell against the unjust laws of heaven. I devote an entire chapter to the Domenicis, who also translated Canto 33 of the Inferno in the third chapter of my dissertation, entitled South is Hell. De Domenicis places his translation of Dante at the beginning of a collection entitled Forastero, Foreigners, in which he includes translations of international poets like Victor Hugo, Heinrich Heine, and Charles Baudelaire. Such a decision reads as a reminder of the colonial force with which his language was imposed on the rest of the peninsula during unification. Florentine, de Domenicis may be seen as saying, "It's as foreign to me as the language of the other poets I translate in this collection." This agonistic dimension is even more pronounced in Canti dell'altra vita, written between 1891 and 1898. The canti are comprised of 5 canticles: Infierno, Inferno, Purgatorio, Purgatory, Paraiso, Paradise, Guerra in Paraiso, War in Paradise, and Tempo dopo, Time After. The Domenicis tells the story of a poor peasant named Pietro Lau, condemned to hell for having stolen grain to feed his starving family. He pleads his case to the devil, who takes pity on him and promises him a job inside as a gardener. Thereupon, he falls in love with his daughter and proceeds to marry her. Witnessing the injustices of the afterlife, he decides to stage a revolution, ultimately dethroning the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, who are condemned to walk the earth as vagabonds. I read this carnivalesque parody as an allegory of the South's embattled position vis-a-vis the North during the post-unification decades, a time which saw the formulation, which not only saw the formulation of the Southern question, but also multiple forms of popular revolt, as in the case of Brigantaggio. Such an enmeshing of aesthetic space with historical time is a prime example of what Mikhail Bakhtin, renowned theorist of the carnivalesque, calls a chronotope, where, quote, space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. More specifically, I argue, de Domenicis turns a trope common among writers of the Southern question of Southern Italy as a backwards, timeless hell on its head by making hell, that timeless place par excellence, the locus of change and revolution. My critical edition of this work makes explicit a gesture already at play in my book, the valorization of minority languages through translation, which brings me to the title of my talk, Italian Dialects as World Literature. How can something as specific and local as Italian dialect be thought of in terms of world literature? Does not world literature necessarily imply an overcoming of the local? I would like to let Dante himself answer. Enumerating Italian dialects in his linguistic treatise De Vulgare Eloquentia, he writes that if one were to take into account all the languages and sublanguages of the peninsula, quote, you would find that even in this tiny corner of the world, the count would take us not to 1,000 different types of speech, but well beyond that figure. What are the implications of this microcosmic dimension of Italy for the world? Dante seems to furnish an answer in the following pages, in the following passage, in which he alludes to his experience in exile. Quote, for whoever is so misguided as to think that the place of his birth is the most delightful spot under the sun, may also believe that his own language, his mother tongue that is preeminent among all others. And as a result, he may believe that his language was also Adam's. To me, however, the whole world is a homeland, like the fish to sea. Though I drink from the Arno before cutting my teeth and love Florence so much that, because I loved her, I suffer exile unjustly. I'll skip the rest of this fantastic passage for the sake of time. In this passage, this brings me to my conclusion. In this passage, Dante moves the Italian language in a direction different than the Italian nationalists, away from its territorial point of origin, Florence, back to its Mediterranean belonging, the Arno, and beyond it, the seas, the oceans, where it meets and is mixed with other languages. We have here something like a Mediterranean archipelagic imaginary, a poetics of relation in Caribbean theorist Edouard Glissant's sense of the term. To be sure, Italy is not an island, but it is almost an island, as the word peninsula indicates in Latin. Pene, almost, insula, island. A body of land almost entirely surrounded by water, Italy's place in Mediterranean networks of relation has been the subject of much lively scholarly debate in recent years. In future work, I aim to trace the Italian language's drift and flux as it travels beyond the Mediterranean, across the Atlantic, to reach the shores of the Americas. In the summer of 2025, I will be on a James J. Perricone Fellowship at the Queens College Library of New York City to explore the dialectal writings of Italian immigrants in the early 20th century. Countering the perceived notion that most immigrants forgot their mother tongues upon emigrating to the US, I aim to demonstrate what in the title of my project I aim to demonstrate that many of them, in fact, sought to preserve them, forming both linguistically and geographically what in the title of my project I refer to as so many little Italies. This, in short, is my big claim for Italian dialects as world literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Giancarlo. Now the Q&A time. Gianni.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Question, did you investigate the translation into Neapolitan, for example, of Terentius or other big poem, I think including Homer, between 17th century and 18th century Naples? Have you ever looked at that?
I look at three Neapolitan translations of the Divine Comedy. One is by Iaccarino, Dante Popolare, which is in translation of the Inferno, and there are two more of that.
What are the dates of those? 19th century?
Yes, they're all interestingly gathered around 1860. So what's interesting, I should have mentioned this in the talk, is that so Carlo Porta is actually the first to really translate Dante. He does several cantos around 1820, right? So whereas there's a long tradition of translating other poets, Ariosto as well, Tasso, into dialect, the phenomenon of translating Dante into dialect really begins in the Risorgimento, which makes sense because this is when Dante is really being, appropriated as well as brought back, let's say, from his sort of canonical exile in the classical period, where he is sort of somewhat kicked to the curb in favor of, the more classical styles of Petrarch or Boccaccio, right? So it's this kind of interesting, engagement with that, but also, I mean, that's the whole sort of knot of questions, right? As to what extent is it conspiring with this kind of unification process that takes up Dante as a figure of national unity, and to what extent is it also subverting that, right? Recalling Dante's own sort of vernacular move in the 13th century.
Thank you.
Pantalea.
Thank you, Giancarlo, for your presentation. I have a teaching question. I was fascinated by the idea of a course on poetics of the second language. I was wondering if you have some strategies that you can share about how to teach, how to engage students who are learning Italian, so they're still getting familiar with the standard language, to like recognize, appreciate, or work on texts, are there in dialects or like written in Italian from a non-native speakers? What are your strategies?
Well, with that course in particular, I mean, it's great both, thematically, but also practically. I always start with Jhumpa Lahiri, who's modern and who also, has a relatively simple style, and who really kind of, I think, because of that, also sort of opens the gate towards, learning Italian and encouraging them just from a practical level. So I also use the class in a way as, what is part of my general philosophy, that languages are good for humankind, and then in particular French and Italian, which are my two, languages. But I say, pick any language really. So in general, I also want the course to be a spur to learn learning languages, among which Italian. Now, of course, then, as we get into the weeds of the class, these questions of like, yes, well, what is Italian kind of comes up, Giunta Lahiri herself kind of addresses them. But yeah, when dealing with, say, let's say, Pierpaolo Pasolini, there's a great book by Brian McCrea called Languages of the Night that I assign, in which he sort of discusses Pasolini's engagement with dialect in connection with his queerness. So with that case, I have to admit that it's more of a thematic approach that I take. Obviously, it would be difficult for them to engage with the dialect, but McCrea does a great job of providing translations, but at least it's there. At least the texture is there, the texture of, and I think that even exposure is better than nothing, just to make them aware of this reality. But of course, I think it raises the question that, to what extent does language teaching, as we teach it, kind of reinforce a kind of monolithic conception of language, right? Because obviously it's not very practical to teach all the variants, right? And translation raises those same questions, right? Translation also can be seen as, on one hand, yes, moving in between languages and all that, but also solidifying, reifying languages, because we kind of translate from sort of blocks, or we think of translation as moving between blocks, which is where I think the phenomenon of dialectal, or just dialectal translation in general, is interesting. We don't usually think of minor languages participating in the translation process, right? Intralingual translation, as Jakobsen calls it. Translation within languages and not just between languages. So yeah, so it opens up a whole can of worms, but I mean, I think you kind of have to have a certain taste.
Thank you. Thank you too much.
Stefano?
Thank you so much for raising so many points. I found your paper communication really fascinating, and I also found it a little bit twofold, in the sense that you transnationalize Italian studies at the beginning of your presentation with all the sort of bilingual authors, as well as authors in dialects, as well as in translation. And on the other hand, you trans-regionalize Italian studies with your Dante case study. So how do you feel that these two levels match and dialogue with each other? On the one hand, we have this issue of the transnationalization. On the other hand, this issue of trans-regionalization. How do they fit within a broader framework?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And thank you for that terminology, which I think just helps me. I think I myself, I'm always looking for interesting ways of conceptualizing a project. And I think that question of transnationalism versus or as transregionalism, or maybe transregionalism as transnationalism, is actually very helpful, because I think that is my intervention in what is this new context of transnational studies, right? And maybe it speaks to what I was saying about translation too, right? How can we have a translationalism, a transnationalism that doesn't reify these languages, right? That actually also does like an internal work of diversification as well, right? So I would like to think them together, but I think that, just as I was saying, the terms for my own kind of linguistic journey are sometimes failing, mother tongue, is it really my mother tongue? It's my father's tongue, and so on and so forth. Yeah, I think it also calls into question like the whole vocabulary we have for thinking about languages. And I think that I'm constantly trying to find other words, better words, perhaps, inventing terms that sort of help me think through this. But yeah, I would like to have my cake and eat it too, or I would like both to kind of dialogue with each other, to kind of interanimate each other at an almost molecular level, right? So that when we're doing the transnationalism, we also retain the minutia of what a language or a region is.
Hands up.
Okay, Q&A time is over. Thank you to the three finalists for the wonderful presentations. And now I think, Cinzia, to pass the floor to.
Thank you, Franco. Thank you for the wonderful work in, directing us through these, through the three presentations, extremely enjoyable. The first thing that I want to say is that there is an opportunity to have a picture here of everybody that has participated. And so I'd like to ask the ISNAF admin to go ahead and take a picture of us all. Right, and Alessandro, let me know when you are done.
3, 2, 1. Done.
Thank you so much. And now it is my pleasure to invite the sponsor to say a couple of words. So Fabrizio Renzi, as the CEO of RnB4CULTURE, I think we are giving him the floor. He has been upgraded to panelist. Ciao,
Wow,
Fabrizio.
fantastic. Ciao, Cinzia. That's always a pleasure to hear from these events. By the way, congratulations a lot to the jury, because the selection was outstanding, and congratulations to the three finalists that for me are three winners, because clearly the three of them were fantastic. Just a few words. I ran for 31 years, was the director of IBM, a very boring engineer. But now I love to work about culture and digital humanities. That's why we, together with Cinzia and Enrica, we put together this prize on digital humanities. I run museum. I do software for museum. I run museum in Italy at this moment. I run M9 in Venezia, Brera in Milano, Fabbrica del Vapore in Milano, Museo della Banca d'Italia, and the Museo Federico II. Museo della Carta in Fabriano, that is very interesting, and the new one in Roma on the women of Renaissance. That's why I would be delighted, Cinzia and Rika, to come to meet your fantastic finalists while there, because the topic of women Renaissance is the one that we are putting in the new museum we are creating. We put holograms like Lucrezia Borgia, or Vittoria Colonna, or Bellezza Orsini, or Beatrice Cenci, and so on, together with the fantastic Perugino painting, the best fresco discovered in Roma in the last 20 years. So we are looking forward to come to Washington, D.C. and to meet your fantastic finalists. Cinzia, just a few words on the three topics. Laura, if the background you have in your home is true, we can open a museum at your house. We are looking forward to. And Pantalea, the blasphemy discussion was fantastic, because on top of the three characters we have selected for the museum, we are also looking for people from the real Roman people in the Renaissance, like Imperia, that was the courtesan that when she died, all the people in Rome were attending her funeral, like Michelangelo, Raphael, and all the others. And also blasphemies, and also the other topic. I mean, the real is fantastic. And Giancarlo, your discussion on dialect is very interesting. Every time I come to US, I believe you are protecting Italian dialects there, because you are a bubble, a time bubble of dialects that is outstanding. When I was living with my wife there for 2.5 years in Texas, no real US, something down there. And I remember we speak our own dialect all the time at home. That's something that's another great, fantastic value that ISNAF is bringing. You are protecting our language, my friends. Cinzia, grazie. And grazie Professor Franco and Pierno, very good selection, and grazie Pantalea, Laura, and Giancarlo, and Enrica. It was fantastic to hear from you tonight, and it would be very, very nice to meet you all in Washington while there. Okay.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Again, ISNAF is very grateful to you for the sponsorship. We do appreciate having an award that is in the humanities. It's a good complement to our 5 awards that sort of speak different languages, different dialects perhaps, but this one make us feel perhaps all more human. And so it's very enjoyable. Again, I really want to thank the member of the Executive Council for the United for the Humanities Award, which is Professor Pierno. He's doing this for the first time this year, so he has been welcome in our body of Scientific Council for this discipline. The jury, I've got to hear from some of you. It has been wonderful to see you interact with the finalists, 3 wonderful young investigators. So congratulations to all 3 of you. And I look forward to next month to the event at the embassy. And I hope to continue this wonderful conversation that we have had today around these topics. With this, the symposium comes to a close. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Grazie.